Welcome to another 5-minute religious education recap video. We're on the exam board Eduqas. We are looking at foundational Catholic theology. We're exploring the good and evil unit. Today's session will be Augustine and privation, and I'm hoping by the end of this session you'll be able to explain how Augustine describes evil as a privation. So to get us started off, we need to understand this word Theodicy first. Now, Theodicy comes from the Greek words for God, which is theos, and the word justice, which is dike. Now, theodicies are arguments which try to show God still exists and is great, even though there is evil and suffering in the world. So it will not deny that there's evil in the world, it will not deny that there's suffering in the world, but it will still say God is great and God still exists. So trying to justify God, even though there's evil in the world. Now, Augustine, he starts his theodicy, so defense of God, by considering what we actually mean by the word evil. Now, traditionally, you might look at a definition which is evil, something which is immoral, bad, harmful, or causes injury or suffering. Well, Augustine rejects that definition completely. And in favour of it, Augustine offers a new definition. And according to St Augustine, evil is not a thing. Okay, rather evil comes about when there's a lack of goodness. And this is what he means by a word called privation. Privation is a lack or an absence of something. So evil, it is just a lack of goodness. Evil is not a thing in its own right. It doesn't exist as an entity within itself. Just when something is less good, that can be described as evil. So Augustine then, he gives some examples to try and help you understand this idea of a privation or an absence of something. And the first one is blindness. He says, when someone's blind, blindness is not a thing. Blindness is the absence of sight. And when someone regains sight, the blindness, it doesn't move elsewhere. It's just not there anymore. He also gives the example of sickness. When someone's sick, sickness is not a thing. Sickness is the absence of health. When health returns, the sickness is gone. It doesn't move somewhere else. Now, in the same way, when something evil happens, it's only described as evil because it's the absence or the lack of good in that situation. Evil is not an independent thing that exists on its own. It's when something is made less good. So anything that takes away from the goodness of God's creation in Genesis is a privation of good, and that's what evil is. So evil is not a thing within itself, it's the lack of something, okay? It's the lack of goodness, just like blindness is the lacking of sight or sickness is the lack of health. Now, Augustine then in evil, he looks at the creation story in Genesis, and he noted that when God created it, it was very good. And this is when Genesis 1, it says, God saw all that he'd made, and it was very good. Now, since God created the universe, and it was good, God cannot be blamed for creating evil. Evil must have come from another source. So ultimately, God is not to blame for evil in the world. So where does evil come from then? Well, God created human beings, and he did so out of love. He wanted us to learn and to grow and to have a relationship with him. And part of that was to give us free will. This is why in Genesis 1:27 we find that we're made in the image of God to grow into his likeness. So it means that we are free to follow God's commandments or not. So free will is a key part of human nature. However, unfortunately, Adam and Eve, the first free people, they misused this free will. They chose to ignore God's instructions in the Garden of Eden. And this misuse of free will made creation less good. When there is an absence of goodness, this is a privation of goodness, and therefore this is evil. So ultimately, it's humans who are to blame for evil in creation, not God. Big question then, how's God still loving and fair if this evil, creation is evil, and he's created humans that have brought about this evil or this privation of goodness? Well, after establishing that humans are to blame, Augustine argues, God sent his only son to die for everyone's sins, even though humans are the cause of evil on this earth. And this shows God's omnibenevolence, so he's still loving, he's still fair, because he's trying to save us even though we've made the mistake. Secondly, God is justified in allowing evil to remain because it's a fair punishment, but it also allows us to appreciate the good in the world by comparing it with the evil. So again, God's justified in allowing it to be here. And finally, Augustine uses an example of a scorpion. It says evil serves a purpose that may be beyond human understanding. For example, just like a scorpion's venom, it's good for the scorpion, but bad for the victim who's stung. Perhaps evil appears bad for humans, but in the entirety of creation, it has an important role and purpose for God. So ultimately, evil does serve a purpose. And when we look at this evil and suffering, ultimately what Augustine argues is that we can explain away moral evil by human misuse of free will. But even natural evil to a degree, we can sit there and we can argue that Adam and Eve destroyed the natural order of creation and they brought about these mistakes or this natural evil. So have a little look at the list down here. try and see if you can link these phrases to Augustine's ideas about privation. If you can do that, you've been successful. If you find it a bit tough, pause the video and go back through it. You know how it goes. If you want to push yourself a little bit further, try some of these example questions. Thank you for your time today, and good luck.